Happy Monday evening to you all, and welcome to our event on the impossibility of justice in a two-party system. We do have a few housekeeping things to go over. If you all could turn on your cameras if you feel comfortable, because it lends itself to feeling like more of a community event. So if that is possible and you feel comfortable doing that, please feel free to turn on your cameras. Also, if you have joined us by phone or otherwise, if you could make sure that your name is put on your Zoom screen. So if you ask a question or something like that, we can address you properly. Please mute yourself when you're not speaking. Also, your voices are very much encouraged in this space. These are community events, even though they're happening virtually. Feel free, if during the event, if you want to jot down questions that are coming to mind, feel free to pop them in the chat. And we will be trying to make time at the end of the event for questions and comments. But if things pop up for you before that time, like I said, feel free to pop questions, thoughts, whatever you have into the chat. So at this time, we have two special guests with us, Andy and Nnamdi, that we're really excited to have to get into this discussion of the impossibility of justice in a two-party system. And at this time, I'm going to turn the floor over to them.
Great. Thank you, Michelle. I'm Andy Ellis. I'm a member of the Baltimore City Green Party. I ran for office in 2018 as a Green in congressional district or in legislative district 45, and I'm thinking about a potential governor's run in 2026. I wanted to do a little bit of my own housekeeping here about this presentation before I turn it over to Nnamdi to introduce himself. Two things. One is I'm going to say the word argument a lot. I come from a background of debate coaching and debate culture, and that means that I often form things as arguments. So to me, what that means is we'll be identifying a problem with the current system, we'll be identifying why it can't change itself, and advocacy for how it should change, and then explain how that solves the problem that we've identified. So if you hear me say argument, it's not that I'm disagreeing with anybody, but it's that I'm making an advocacy for this. The second thing is, this is while I've been doing this work for a long time, this particular argument about the impossibility of justice in a two-party system is one that Nnamdi and I have been working on, but are presenting for the first time tonight. So it is not a closed idea. It is not a completed theory. We're here to share our ideas and to be informed by you all. So that we can revise, refine, and redo the argument based on feedback that we get. So, I'll say the word argument a lot, and this is open and not closed. It's just a presentation of our thoughts, and then some discussion. So, Nnamdi, why don't you introduce yourself?
Yeah, thank you, Andy. So my name is Nnamdi Lumumba. I'm a part of the organizing committee to build an independent electoral party in the state of Maryland. It would be the first party created and led by Black working class people throughout the state. In 2016, I ran as a candidate in Baltimore City's city council election for the 7th district, and I ran as an independent then. My background really is as a community activist and organizer, a working class organizer. The history of America has been that the struggle of Black people, regardless of who's in power, which political party, it's always been a struggle that we've had to collectivize and win allies to push for the question of social justice. So we are just continuing in that struggle, going from activism in the community to taking organizing into the electoral arena. So I think this is a great time. We have an election coming. A lot of people are trying to make decisions. And there are some people who may not be happy with their choices as they think they are now. I think we want to be able to make a more democratic situation happen in this country.
All right. And as I said, I'm Andy Ellis. I'm with the Baltimore City Green Party. The Green Party is a national party that is committed to environmental, racial justice, and economic justice. We've run candidates in national elections for years. We've also elected hundreds of people at the state and local level across the country over the last couple of decades. And I'd say right now we're probably the fourth biggest party in the country at a national level, but we are also very active in Baltimore City. We've run candidates in every Baltimore City election since 2000, and we largely are working to improve democracy so that not just the Green Party can be on the ballot and people can have that choice, but Ujima People's Progress Party, People's Party, and other parties can all be part of a new and better political system. So next slide. So I want to lay out three premises that we're going to touch on tonight and build on about why justice is impossible in a two-party system. I want to give credit for each of them where they come from. The first one is a paraphrase of Lonnie Guinier, and that one is that majority rule is incompatible with democracy in a white supremacist and capitalist society. And this is the idea that got Lonnie Guinier in a lot of trouble. For those that don't know, Lonnie Guinier was Bill Clinton's nomination to be the head of the Civil Rights Department of the Justice Department early in his term. And Lonnie Guinier had written a whole lot about the incompatibility of democracy with racial minorities. And that got used against her in order to shut down her nomination before she even got a hearing, because for the most part, both parties were afraid of her criticism of the two-party system. The second premise that we're going to have here is that a two-party doom loop has taken hold, and that means that two corporate parties exist solely to make sure the other one never wins. All elections are nationalized, polarization is a billion-dollar business, and large numbers of people are dropping out of the political system. Every election is thus the most important election in our lifetime, and redistributive justice, even as it has occurred in the two-party system in the past, is impossible to envision at this point. This comes from Lee Drutman, who has written a book called The Two-Party Doom Loop. And Lee Drutman is a white man, and we'll talk about that in a second. The third point here is that the Democratic Party has worked to capture the most important movements for justice and has simultaneously worked to shut down alternative parties. This is a premise that is developed well by Eddie Glaude Jr. in his book called book called Democracy in Black, How Race Still Enslaves the American Soul. Eddie Glaude Jr. was roundly criticized for making these arguments and has been roundly criticized for making these arguments and has made them at great peril to his career at different times. Now, Lonnie Guinier and Eddie Glaude Jr. are both Black folks who are criticizing the two-party system in America, and they have both suffered significant career impacts and significant life impacts as a result of doing that. Lee Drutman, on the other hand, is a white man with a political science degree who has gotten a foundation, a think tank, and all of those types of things to develop these ideas. So I think it's important to note where these sources have come from and where the consequences of the people who speak on these issues are. Some people get promotions, some people lose jobs. With that, I want to turn to Nnamdi to go through the history of Black voting rights in America, because this is the timeline with which we think this story should be told. Oh, sorry, terms first. Real quick, we are in agreement with how Baltimore Racial Justice Action defines racial equity and racial justice. We see this as a redistributive process that cannot simply be about representation and cannot simply be about electing people electing people in order to get justice. It has to be a redistribution of power, wealth, and other means. Nnamdi, is there anything you want to say on this slide?
No, I just think, again, that the real concern for us is, what does democracy look like? For most people in America, democracy has always been defined by voting. And in truth, democracy around the world is far more expansive than just waiting for an election to have input. And so this is where part of this starts, because there's an argument that has been made about just running as independents, but we really want to talk about the ability of parties to institutionalize, to bring out the strength of people's numbers, right, as a part of this process, and not really just to look at the voting question, because that's a very simplistic way to understand democracy. Next slide. So I think it's always important, and I won't spend a lot of time here, but I think it's really important because we don't want to pretend that America starts off as the home of the brave and where democracy has always reigned, right? That the truth is that the United States started off as land theft and genocide. It started off as the enslavement and chattel slavery of people of African descent, and that there has had to be a consistent struggle with those who are in power to just be recognized as human beings and as citizens. So we have here the 1867, the whole concept of the Civil Rights Act to grant citizenship, not yet the right to vote to all native-born Americans. Obviously, Africans at this point had the shipment of Africans had been ceased, but the fact that we were born here and not still seen as citizens and sometimes not as human beings was problematic. Next slide. 1869, Congress passes the 15th Amendment, giving African-American men the right to vote, because clearly women don't deserve the right to vote in both the Black or white community at this stage. Again, the struggle for democracy is always expanding. Let's go to the next slide. And so even though there's a jump here, I want people to understand this, and this is where even some of the discussions around third parties are interesting. So as Black men were able to get the right to vote, and they were allowed to vote in the elections, the fact that the first party, the first major third party to win an election was the Republican Party, and that third party had a social justice component built into what it was arguing, that it wanted to end the system of slavery. There were a lot of opinions about what to do with people who would be formerly enslaved, but it was a social justice question at its core. And this is the first time we see where the two-party system clearly could not solve that problem, and a third party, which was supported by a very energized base of people, was able to make a difference. But because of that difference, we start to have here 1896 to try to end what is formally officially called radical reconstruction. They started passing things called grandfather clauses, which said basically if you were a former slave, right, you could not vote. You would lose your rights. And so you saw massive drops in voter participation. And this was as the two parties themselves started to reconsolidate their power bases. There was no evidence of social justice happening in 1896. Next slide, please. By 1940, you only had a 3% eligibility of African Americans in the South who are registered to vote. Jim Crow laws like literacy tests and poll taxes were meant to keep African Americans from voting. A lot of us have obviously seen dramatizations of people well prepared for these poll taxes still being turned around. Again, at the cutting edge of social justice, the two-party system was failing people who demanded the most minimum participation in a democratic society. Next slide. 1964, so you have laws now starting to outlaw that with the adoption of the 24th Amendment. Let's go to the next slide. 1965, right? So you start to now have, and of course, between these slides, these are not just moments of aha moments for leaders in political power. These are decades of democratic struggle, right, for social justice, for civil rights in this country, democratic rights. And so you start to see an intensification of what that looks like as a motivated base again, wins allies and is able to clearly define what social justice looks like. Next slide. Then you have the passing of the Voters' Rights Act by Lyndon B. Johnson. Again, the Democratic Party was not a party that was willing to do this easily. Literally, when Lyndon Johnson famously said, "Make me," well, in a sense that he wanted enough political pressure to be put on him where he had cover, right? He had to do this to explain why he did it. It's also important to remember that when we talk about the two-party system, the new third party that emerged was the Republican Party, which was liberal at that time. The Democratic Party was the more conservative party during the era of slavery. It was the slave owners party as of its inception. So we moved to 1965. Can we go to the next slide? 1970, the Voters Act right was extended and signed by Richard Nixon. That was 5 years after the initial. Let's go to the next one. 82. So you have these extensions, and I think this is something that people have, again, always took for granted, that just because the law was passed, that there did not need to be extensions of these Voter Rights Acts. And so it's not just it's not just baked into the way the system works. It has to be fought for, it has to be defended. The Voters' Rights Acts themselves can be changed and expanded upon. And as we shall soon see, it can also be whittled away. Next slide. 1990, due in part to the enforcement of the Voters' Rights Act, the number of Black elected officials in Georgia rose from 495 in rose to 495 in 1990, right? So again, we started to see this cresting of Black political participation. Obviously, this is just focused around electoral politics. We tend to don't even think of the civil rights movement itself as a mass democratic process. The next slide, please. And then Congress in 2006 extends the Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act for another 25 years. I think the reason why we added this slide was just for people to understand how precarious this concept of democracy is. That we have intervals of extensions being added to what should be a human right to participate in the democratic process. And we continue to see changes and extensions being made to that right that we think should be a civil and human right. All right. Is this the last slide, or go to the next slide, please? So 2011, a record number of restrictions to vote were introduced in state legislatures nationwide, including photo ID requirements, cut to early voting rights, and restrictions to voter registration. Many of these states have histories of voter discrimination, right, kind of covered under the Voters' Rights Act. So, and we've seen this continue to go, right? So conservative forces have figured out that you can't do this at the national level. Let's do it at the state level. Again, this question of democratic participation is precarious. It is not something that we should take for granted. That's why we're having this discussion about opening up new fronts. I hope that's the last. Is that the last slide? We can go ahead and go past that. So I think that was just really the essence of what we're trying to get to, that there's a history that needs to be understood. Let's not enter this discussion as if all has been good. We just opened our eyes, and now we're talking about what democracy looks like in the two-party system.
Thank you, Nnamdi.
Excellent. And then what we advocate in this, so what Nnamdi and I are going to advance today are a couple of ideas that we think can begin to address this problem. The first one is moving from zero-sum democracy to positive-sum democracy. And what we mean by that is that we should not have a winner-take-all system in which the only people who have access, in which 51% of the votes gets you 100% of the power. We need a system in which everybody can feel represented and everybody can take turns having power and make sure that everybody is participating, instead of a system in which winner take all, instead of a winner take all system. A winner take all system, as Lonnie Guinier says, makes it nearly impossible for racial minorities to be able to ever have any sense of justice in a white supremacist and capitalist society. Do you want to take the next one?
More healthier political parties involved in government. I think obviously the very essence of the two-party system is that the assumption is there are only two legitimate parties, right, that really matter. And that is how the system itself is made up, and that's how people tend to fall. The problem is that it leaves the democratic process of people really being engaged in what decisions making it looks like to the side. And what we're saying is that more political parties mean more people, even at smaller levels, are engaged. They know that they have representation that's listening to them, that's fighting for their interests. Maybe that representation looks like 1% of the national leadership. Maybe it looks like that on the state level, but then it does exist, right? And so that people who have been historically, once their candidates are no longer relevant, they can't have a voice, right? I think that is really detrimental to how people understand politics. Again, it reduces people to only waiting for elections to have critical impact, and having more political parties who are involved at different levels in government means that that part of the electorate, that part of the population has someone's ear who they know will really be receptive to their interests, whatever they may be.
And then
Winner, do you see that question? Can we clarify what you mean by a winner-take-all system?
yeah, so I mean, in a majoritarian system, the person with the most votes is the person who gets elected, and so that goes well into the next recommendation we have, which is stop having single-member districts and move to multi-member districts with proportional representation. Right now, we tend to look at politics as a spectrum, left, right, and whoever moves farthest on that spectrum, whoever gets the most votes out of that for that single seat wins the seat. In a proportional system, we move and we recognize that there are a lot of different political tendencies within most electorates, and so if you have 30% of the votes, you get a seat sometimes. And now that doesn't mean that the people with more votes don't get more seats. But if we think about sharing and taking turns with power, as we talked about in a positive sum democracy, having more people be able to be represented in government makes more people feel like that they can be heard. So, I don't want to get too far into. Nnamdi and I will be doing a podcast next week on the 21st, where we will get more into the wonky details of proportional representation, and we can talk about it some tonight. But it is a means of allowing a different kind of politics to emerge, where people are represented based on their proportion in the electorate, and not a winner-take-all system.
Well, let's go to the next slide.
But so actually, I think that's that is the sort of end of the presentation part we have here. And we really just wanted to lay these things out for the discussion that is going to come after this. But, we wanted to lay that history out, some of those premises and some of those advocacy. So as we go forward, we can have something to be grounded in.
I also, just before we moved off of that, it goes back to the more healthier political parties. I also think that especially in Maryland, but it happens in a lot of places, what we've come to a lot of times, especially when you don't have what's considered a motivated election cycle year, is that you can have a turnout that is extremely low, right? Sub 25% of participation, and someone can win, a majority of those votes. And the question becomes, what mandate does that person really have, right, to vote? The truth is that people's non-participation in elections is a vote with their feet to stay home, right? And it's a denial of the kind of leadership that we're starting to see consistently, where people just opt out. More political parties mean there are more specific people, more specific agendas, there are more platforms. And it brings people who now have more affinity to those candidates, to those platforms, out to participate. I think it makes, obviously, the democratic process more invigorated, but also I think the more inclusion people have in it, right, the more people are encouraged to understand what these political ideas are. And then you can actually say, well, when someone wins that election, especially when you're talking about a mayor, a governor, then you're starting to see real turnout that really reflects a real democratic process, as opposed to, again, if 20–30% of the population shows up, whoever wins that somehow now represents a democratic process. And I think we really have to challenge that notion.
Thank you. Thank you, Andy and Nnamdi, for giving us some historical framing as we continue with this conversation. I wanted to first start off by both of you kind of giving us a sense of how you got involved in third parties, since, it's not popular it's not a popular concept, right? So just a little bit about like maybe what in your own personal past brought you to this place to be so involved in a party that's not part of our two-party system.
Well, for myself, it really started to be a critical look at who the candidates were, looking at the platforms. And I did this as a college student, and they just literally didn't speak to me. And I can honestly say during that 18 to 24 age range, I was not interested, right? And I can honestly say I did look, and I was like, I'm not doing that, and I chose to opt out in that time frame. And then as I got older, literally when I looked at platforms and I did not like what I saw, I used my democratic right to do a write-in candidate. So, and I knew that was my legal right to do. I knew my candidates weren't going to win, but if I was going to show up, I was going to vote for who I was going to vote for, and I wouldn't deny myself, right, like the lesser of two evils kind of choice, right? So, and that was also informed, importantly, by my political activity. When you're engaged, you know what the real issues are, and you're not going to settle for people who clearly won't answer your political interests. They just won't.
Thank you, Nnamdi.
Yeah, so I think I was a politics junkie as a little kid. Like my mom worked for a Democratic senator, and my dad did media and PR for national level Republican candidates. And like we watched the McNeil Lehrer NewsHour at dinner. We were that house. And then in 1992, the Ross Perot campaign was really interesting to me because I was bouncing around between whichever party was not in power. I was mad at the party that was in power, but I didn't really find myself supporting the people who weren't in power. I just was mad at the party that was in power, which is how it's supposed to work in a two-party system. And the Ross Perot campaign showed me the possibility that there can be other choices. I wasn't able to vote in '92. I think I was still in 10th grade or something like that, but I was excited by it, and it sparked a bit of independence for me. Then I sort of registered as a Democrat for a while because I was in Maryland and I was in college, and that's what you do. And but I still wasn't terribly satisfied with it. And by 2000, I was really inspired by the Ralph Nader campaign because he was speaking about values and with solutions that made sense to me, and he seemed to have an excitement and a movement behind him. So I think that I got to a place where, you know, I don't think I voted for a Democrat for president for a long time, but for a long time, the presidency was the only thing I cared about. In 2004 or 2003, 2004, I had a friend who was a debate coach who ran for mayor of New Paltz, New York, and they managed to win the mayorship and win the city council, and he used the power vested in the office of the mayor of New Paltz to start performing same-sex marriages. And those same-sex marriages ended up forcing the hand of the New York legislature and the New York government to allow same-sex marriage. And so that sort of showed me the possibility. Then I went through a sort of period of really radical politics where I was disengaged entirely from the two-party system, you know, focused on anti a bunch of stuff, anti-capitalism, anti-colonial things. But at some point I realized that there needed to be a political home for me to attach to be able to make constructive politics as opposed to just being opposed to things. And I found the Green Party. Like I said, I had voted for Greens a bunch of different times. I looked at the values and the platform of the Green Party, and I thought that it spoke to me more than any political party I had ever seen. And in 2015, I joined the Baltimore City Green Party and became an active organizer with the city party, with the state party, and with the national party. And, you know, still am here, still trying to build a constructive politics that lifts up other parties in order to be able to play in this current two-party system, or in Baltimore City, this one-party system.
Thank you. Thank you both for sharing. I want to kind of start with the question that I think is on a lot of people's minds when they hear about this like idea and this concept about third parties, right? And I think the major pushback is always, we can't do it right now because Trump is running, right? And more than likely, we will probably have a rematch of Biden and Trump for this upcoming national election, and people are already starting. You're the ones who are responsible for fascists, getting into office, right? What do you all give as an argument and a pushback to these ideas that are very loud in these circles about why now is the time to push for third parties?
Nam, do you want to take this one or start with this one, or you want me to?
You go first, Andy.
So first of all, I'm a Green who doesn't really love the fact that we run presidential candidates every 4 years. I understand that the democratic decision-making process of the party suggests that that is a good strategy, but I think I'm in a minority in my party in doing that. I think the reason I am is because where I think it is important to develop smaller parties is at the local level and at the state level. I think that's where the most traction can be gained and where the most underrepresentation is happening. That being said, I also think that the national level elections are the place where the ideas and concepts of third parties and smaller parties get the most attention, and that the effort of the Democrats and Republicans to shut those voices out since Ross Perot have stopped the ability to have those ideas and policies be in the political mainstream. So what I would say is, if you think about every major redistributive justice push that has happened in the United States through policy, it has been because outside forces and inside forces are working together in order to transform the system. If you think about abolition, if you think about women's rights, if you think about the New Deal, and if you think about the civil rights movements, all of those had third parties there. And so when this argument gets made about spoiling elections, about Trump, et cetera, that is an attempt to shut down the forces of redistributive and social justice that have used presidential elections and big-scale elections in order to put ideas into the political mainstream that are not discussed by the two parties. So, yeah, I worry. I mean, look, we live in Maryland. Our vote doesn't count anyway. Presidential voting is the most performative election we can engage in the state of Maryland because our electoral votes are guaranteed to go to the Democrats unless the Republicans win 46 other states. So if you look at the two times in the last 40 years or so that the Maryland's votes have gone to a Republican, it's Reagan and Bush. I think Papa Bush. I think those are the two elections where that happened, but those were landslide elections. Like Reagan won 48 states, and so Maryland was one of them. So at a local level, the spoiler doesn't really matter. At a national level, it is used to shut that argument is used to shut out the ability to develop state and local and small political parties that are fighting for justice. And I also don't love that smaller parties are forced to run presidential candidates in order to show up on the ballot. And I don't love that our party has taken that strategy for years. So those are sort of we could have a whole conversation about the spoiler argument, but those are my sort of points on it right now.
I just wanted to clarify. So you're saying that the smaller parties, in order to even run local elections, have to put up a national candidate? Is that what you said?
So one of the ways of qualifying for and staying on the ballot so that down ballot candidates can run in many states is getting 1%, 2%, 5% in presidential elections. So if the Green Party gets 1% in a presidential election in Maryland, that gets them 2 additional years of ballot access so that they can run in state parties or in state elections. So that is part of the reason that smaller parties consistently have developed this strategy over the last 20 years is and why you see libertarians and Greens running 50 state races, because they're trying to make sure that they can stay on the ballot for lower parties. In Maryland, it's 1%. And that's okay, right? Like I said, Maryland, whatever, it has no impact on presidential races. But wouldn't it make much more sense if you could stay on the ballot because you did well in a local race or you did well in a state delegate race, not incentivizing the behavior that they say that they want to prevent?
Right. Thank you, Andy. Nnamdi, did you want to add to that?
Well, I'm always entertained by the concept of spoiling an election, right? So we now have to have a justification where the better candidate with the better platform and the better message is now not winning people's votes. And that's somehow a concept of spoiling because someone with a better platform and a better message spoke to an electorate, right? So that's one of the just philosophical problems we have. But second of all, no single voter in America ever votes for whoever becomes president. The Electoral College does that, and not any of us who are elected, who are voters. And that is a system put in place to protect a ruling class so that no matter who gets in, the right winner who represents white supremacy, who represents capitalism, who represents the interests of very conservative economic interests, will always stay in office. And I think that's where we also have to dig deep. But we also live in a world, right, where the Democrat and Republican parties' voter membership base is shrinking every year, right? And again, I can't sell the Democratic Party, or I can't sell the Republican Party and get people in if people who are tied to those ideas can't sell it to them either. I think what we're starting to see is that more and more people are becoming consciously anti-capitalist, anti-imperialist, anti-racist, and they're not looking at these parties as real solutions to those problems. And they're looking for other choices. I think we've talked a little bit about how people are voting with their feet. The fact is that people will most likely stay home if they don't have a candidate they have affinity for. They won't come out. And again, the question of who gets elected, even if it was something that by like the winner takes, the amount of votes would matter, which it doesn't in America, right? Then that would be a representation of where the politics is. If people show up and vote for who they believe represent their interests, then isn't that democracy? I think we have to move away from that. I think we have to have real discussions about what democracy looks like. If we keep reducing democracy to who you vote for, right? And then you can just go away and everything that happens in your neighborhood, everything that happens in City Hall, everything that happens at your state capitol, that's none of your business, right? Because you've done your part. I think that is really, really destructive to a democratic society. And when you have a society that's mostly made up of working class people, that is a complete recipe for them to be exploited, for their interests to be ignored, and for the long-standing capitalist class in America to continue to expropriate profits and wealth at record levels. So I just think it's a horrible argument, and we really should refute that. And again, the responsibility of voting for your candidate is on the people who are part of the duopoly, right? You have to convince people. You have to earn their vote, and you shouldn't want their vote if you haven't earned it.
Right. Thank you so much. Can we take a second to talk about what you all mean when you say redistributive justice? I know we did have some terms at the beginning, and that wasn't one of them. Could one of you maybe just quickly expound on what you mean when you use that term?
Go ahead,
Sure.
Andy.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, I think if we look at BRJA's terms, if we look at the terms that BRJA uses to define equity and justice, the idea of paying a societal debt, I think, is part of what a redistributive justice looks like. If we want to change the conditions in which capitalism and white supremacy have oppressed the Black vote and a whole bunch of and the working class vote, we have to redistribute money, power, money and power in order to do so, and opportunity as well. So when I say redistributive justice, I think that I mean what BRJA says about racial equity and racial justice is that there's a societal debt, and it takes substantive reallocation of power in order to overcome that debt and to allow for a system. No, Adar, I'm not sure that I think reparations are part of it. Maybe reparations is the right way to describe it, but I think to me, the redistribution of power is the element that is oftentimes not talked about in this, and that is very important for the concept of having a discussion about democracy. So
and also the very nature of a class society when you have political parties. Political parties allow the average person to have access to power, right? It helps organize, it helps shapes ideas, it helps develop leadership. It gives you a platform. Again, it's so important, right, to have this instrument, this tool called a political party, because again, it's not just about the electoral cycle. It's about how working and poor people are able to galvanize themselves. We literally live in a country where, because you're suppressing the access to the ballot by third parties, you're really limiting the access of people who have no influence, who have no resource, who have no dollars, right? To have their voices are really pushed out, and they're forced to like accept options, right? Not just candidate, but political solutions, economic solutions that they had no process in helping to devise.
Thank you. I want to talk a little bit, Nnamdi, I think you kind of were touching a little bit. I think you said something about if we at least lived in a country where the number of votes meant you won the election, which is not true in this country. Could we talk a little bit about, I don't know if you all prepared to talk about the historical implications around the Electoral College, how it is steeped in racism and the slave, and slave culture, enslavement of Black people, and just kind of how it continues today to dispossess, people's political power.
Well, I think obviously the context of the Electoral College was, and this predates even the question of the participation of Black people or immigrants in the electoral process. The Electoral College was a way for the wealthy of America to ensure, right, that not even poor working white men could have an option, an opportunity to win, right? And so it is a protective layer that the American capitalist system has baked into the factor. And the truth is, we only really hear about this when, like, on election night, you really good breakdown about the election maps and what people are really trying to do, right? So again, I mean, the real math isn't getting the most votes. And I think we have to be really honest that that's not the game that's being played when we're talking about electoral politics. It's how to divide up and how to slice and dice electorates. It's how you play to ethnicities. It's how you play to corporations and invested interests to get those things mobilized state by state by state, so that you can then win the Electoral College race, which really means who's going to govern as the president, right, for 4 years in this country. I think it's really important that we be honest about that, because again, I think America plays on the fact that there's not a lot of political maturity and political education, right? Civics, that most people don't have access to those things, and they don't understand really how politics in America works.
Right. Thank you. Did you have anything to add to that, Andy?
Yeah, so I mean, I think for me, the part of this that is the Electoral College in the present day forces the nationalization of all elections. It forces it aids the concept that says our job, each of the job of the corporate parties is to ensure that the other one doesn't win. And so all politics gets funneled into these 5 or 6 states once every 4 years, and every election is said to be related to that. That allows the two parties to raise a tremendous amount of money and allows the two parties to make every single race that occurs up and down the ballot a referendum on whether they should be in power or the other party should be in power. So I think as it works currently, as part of the doom loop of two-party polarized politics, it ensures that the interests of Black voters often don't get heard because they have to subordinate their needs to the Democratic Party winning those 7 states or whatever. Or, for example, if we think about what's going on in Gaza right now, there are a lot of credible people who are saying, even if you think there is genocide occurring in Gaza right now, you can't vote against Joe Biden because Trump might win. And in two-party system, that is a description of how things work, but it is ridiculous that we have a system in which the line is not genocide, right? Like, there's no line if the line is not genocide. And if you believe that Joe Biden is supporting genocide and Gaza, it can't be that the next sentence is, and you should vote for him anyway. And so that is, I think, what at the root of why we think that justice is impossible in a two-party system, because it forces everything to be about those 7 electoral states that could possibly determine the outcome. And it forces arguments like, even if you believe Joe Biden is committing genocide in Gaza, you should vote for him anyway, because otherwise Trump will win. And the absurdity of that argument, I think, exposes the way the system ensures the impossibility of justice.
Thank you. I wanted us to talk, or you all to talk a little bit about the alternatives to the two-party system. So we've talked about why this doesn't work and how this works against justice. Could you talk about like what some possible alternatives could be?
Yeah, I'll start on this one. I think that there's a couple of good ways to think about what the alternatives are. The first one is a world of no parties, in which we just have independent candidates, and they are just representing themselves, and the people who vote for them vote for them. And this is a big push of a lot of the electoral reform movement right now. Let's get rid of partisan elections. Let's go to a place where we're just voting for the candidate. The problem with that is that without parties as an identifier of values and solutions, you oftentimes default to the things that already make people be considered valuable in American society and American politics. So people see, so systems that don't have parties tend to favor those who already have access to money, wealth, and power. But that's one set of the systems, is we get rid of parties altogether and we start talking about and we just go with people and things like that. The second solution is a sort of third party where there's a good governance party in the middle. And this is what you'll hear from like No Labels and Larry Hogan and Joe Manchin or Andrew Yang and Forward, is that the real problem is that the two parties are polarized and we need a party in the middle in order to, regulate them and make common sense deals. I think the way that we see that working out is that actually draws people to the right most of the time. If you notice, the people who are most actively advocating it is Joe Manchin, it is Larry Hogan, it is the person it's Cheney, it's Lieberman. These are folks who want to bring politics to the right and strip the ideology out of governments so that they can simply, make things better for corporations for the most part. The third type of system, and I think the one that Nnamdi and I are arguing for, is one in which multiple parties have access to be part of government, in which you may have those 3 parties that we just mentioned, Republican, good government, and Democrats, but you also have ideological parties on the left or the right or based on the grassroots that are oriented in a different way and that are at a local level and that are pushing for change in a different way. And I think that for the most part, the history of Black participation in third parties, or Black participation, is one that exists in the multiple party world or in the independent candidate world. And so, if you think about like Lenora Fulani was a successful Black independent candidate that helped, pretty successful. I think first Black woman to be on all 50 ballots at a point. And, whether I agree with Lenora Fulani's politics or not, she was able to galvanize a good chunk of the vote. So I think that, if you think about those 3 types, no parties, 3 parties, or multiple parties, you can start to think about different ways that outside groups have access to influence the people who are in the governing coalition.
Thank you.
Yeah, I just quickly, so I think Andy has laid out the different types of options, but I also think that one of the really important things that we're trying to break through is that when you limit the access of political parties, you also limit the access of political voices, right? And that you can even give the impression that there are only really 2 answers, maybe 3, right? That in a country of 300 million plus people, there are only really 2 choices that people can go with. And if you don't go with those 2 choices, you're either a spoiler or you're someone who's not educated. And the truth is that when you live in a society that is so radically split, in like a capitalist society between wealth and access, right? There are layers of people's opinions, even within the Democratic and Republican Party umbrellas. There are layers of differences that get squashed, right? And what you end up getting at the end are people who are just not motivated to participate in an electoral, not just electoral, in a democratic process. And again, the call that we're making is that let's really have real democracy. Let's have people who have minority of opinions have an organized minority opinion. Why? Because that minority opinion might one day be that no one should be a slave, right? Because that one time that was a minority opinion in this country as well that won the day. So we have to be able to allow people to have access. We have to be able to critique capitalism. We have to be able to critique imperialism. Do we want to spend money this way? Do we want influences just because you're rich and wealthy, disproportionate to your numbers? We want to be able to open this up. And I think, again, if you press down and you make sure that political discussion, political debate is squashed, then you can, at the very least, extend out what you think is your control and your influence. And that's not a real tenable situation for a democratic country.
Thank you. Can we talk a little bit about independent candidates? What are your all's thoughts on that?
So at least, I mean, I think independent candidates have a place. I don't think they're the answer, because the truth is the most successful independent candidates that we think of, or those who literally form parties around their persona, it's people who are rich white guys, right? With national platforms and you know, and to be honest, though they might have been outliers, they fundamentally still believe in the essence of how things work. White supremacy, capitalism, who controls the wealth in this country, no redistribution of wealth. I mean, they may debate how much of that should be in different sectors, but those are things that are off the table. I think that that independent candidates in some ways give access to ideas. As an activist, I think there's a place for that. It doesn't have the best venue, right, for an activist, but it is a form of democracy that I'm saying should be on the table. But it is not a great option, right? When you are really trying to get your ideas out and you're really trying to win people to those ideas, I think we really have to consider that that's probably not the best option that we would like to see.
Yeah, and I agree with Nnamdi on this. I think that independent candidates are better. Having an independent candidate is better than just having two choices. But I think that independent candidates are not really building power as much as they're raising issues. And I think that, you know, I think it's like, if you look at Cornel West's decision to leave the Green Party, I think it actually makes sense for Cornel West to run as an independent in some ways, because he has access to the media already, he has prominence, he has a name, and he is able to say, Anderson Cooper, book me now. And he may be able to get booked more on CNN to share his message than he would have if he was running with a party that has traditionally been not covered by that network. So I think that that's a really good example of a place where somebody with relative access to power, wealth, and money can benefit from running as an independent candidate. Now, I would say, like, I think Lenora Fulani helped build an independent party in New York out of her run, and helped in that party helped, I think, you know, but she built some power around it. But ultimately, to me, the value of parties is that they collectivize the political power, just like unions collectivize the labor power of working people. And parties are a way to be conduits between people and their government. And that doesn't happen with independents so much, because independents are really about injecting new ideas into the discussion as opposed to rearranging power arrangements.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for clarifying that. So our last question before we get to an open discussion, and I feel like you all have already touched on this, but I guess to sum up this conversation, can you more specifically talk about how this multi-party system benefits racial justice?
Oh, you want to start this one, or you want me to?
Go ahead, Andy.
Okay, so I think if we think about the movements in the past for racial justice through law in the United States. They have often come when outside groups are able to influence those who are in the existing governing coalition. And so I think if we're trying to design a system that is built in order to enable justice, we should build the one that allows folks to most effectively have access to governance and to power, so that ideas can be part of the process of governing, can be part of the process of the very liberal notion almost. We're not really advocating a terribly radical thing here. In some ways, we're advocating an incredibly liberal thing, which is that the more people who have access to government and the more people who are represented in government, the more people will participate in government, and they will be able to suggest more just outcomes. And so I think if you think about different forms of electoral system, we should identify the one that allows most people to have access, most people and movements to have access to the governing coalition and to be part of the process of government redistributing justice, making reparation, and pushing resources and power out. So I think the reason that proportional representation to me is the best approach to that is because it is the one that allows minoritarian voices to be heard, to be represented, and to have access. Look, I don't have any illusions that if we switch to this system, racial justice is going to happen overnight. But I do think that a proportional system in which minoritarian voices are considered worthy of participating in the conversation and are considered worthy of governing is one that is more likely to yield results that are in line with justice. We're still going to have to do a tremendous amount of organizing work. We're still going to have to do a tremendous amount of other justice building and movement building, but at least we would have a political system which accommodated that type of movement building and political organizing and did not challenge everything into one nationalized organization every 4 years.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Andy. Nam, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, certainly. I also think that we have to, again, be realistic in the 21st century, what America really is. The Democrat and Republican Party essentially represent two sides of philosophically believing in some real deep, entrenched ideas about what America is and what it should, how it should project itself. We're talking about differences in how those policies look and what sectors of that capitalist ruling class are able to have more influence, right, with the state. But neither parts of those ruling class elements are vested in anything changing their distribution of power, right? Neither element of that that ruling class really has any policies, right, that would take away influence from themselves and redistribute it to people who have historically been exploited by those social systems. And I think that is where we have to be very honest about what political parties mean when you limit it to two, right? What we often see, and we're seeing more now, is that extremisms can be played off, right? Ethnic groups can be now diced up. You can whip up these cultural wars, right? And as though you're talking about real politics. The fact that people would be engaged in cultural wars and have no real substance discussion about how does a working person survive in this system with increased cost of living? Do we want money to be spent at incredible levels to make war against the world as opposed to feeding people and educating children? Healthcare should be free for every human being. These are discussions that are now taken off the table because now the denial of social and racial justice is not even allowed in balance, right? It's politicized to talk about racial justice. That is not the best way forward for people because now you're forced to make a choice about who am I afraid of, right? Who am I afraid of? As opposed to who has vision, who is articulating what this nation needs. A third party, a more abundant acceptance of political parties would allow people to have answers as opposed to fear, right? And to Andy's point, yes, those smaller parties would still have to organize, but it would also maybe see more coalitions of working class people together, being able to hammer out real ideas that fix their problems regionally, nationally, right? Those are the kind of coalitions that a two-party system denies and keeps out of the process, right? Imagine multiple smaller parties that are able to be in the House of Representatives, in the Senate, right? Those few votes now become the deciding factor for major decisions, right? And as a block, they can block things when they want to, or get things added as a part of that, as a part of a strategy. Again, I think we really have to be realistic about the roles of parties in society, and that limiting people to two parties essentially means you're forcing people out of the process if they don't align to those parties.
Thank you so much. I love what you said about we shouldn't be voting about who we're most afraid of. Like, it's really a sad place to be in as a country, but so true. So thank you both for illuminating those points for us. At this point now, we're going to open up the floor to our participants. If they would like to ask questions of our guests, feel free to take yourself off mute. If you would like to pop your questions, thoughts, whatever, into the chat, you can also feel free to do that as well.
Michelle. Hi, everybody. It's Julia. I do have a question that was earlier up. I'm not sure if it was answered or not, from Gary. And he said, I know this is about the electoral side of democracy, but can you talk about the role that ballot initiatives and other direct democracy tools play in strengthening democracy?
So in Maryland, there is the concept of an organizing committee. It is a group of people who can intervene in the electoral process. It's not standard from state to state to state, right? It's very different. And there are reasons why, obviously, because those who are in power are trying to protect themselves. I think it is important, right? If there were stable electoral parties that didn't have to go through these processes, they could build really long-standing campaigns to make some of these things happen, right? Really hammer home these questions that are forced to have to come up, with these initiatives, just to have that consistency. Again, I'm a big advocate for political parties, not just because of election, but because of the institutionalizing of the ability to organize yourself and fight for these things. I think it is very much a part of that. And again, if you put us on a hamster treadmill every 4 years of trying to get on the ballot, as opposed to doing the work for our constituents, right? That is why we are in this problem right now in Maryland and throughout the country, where you're not allowing political parties, smaller political parties, to really associate themselves with initiatives that have long-standing consequences.
Yeah, and I would add, so I think Maryland is a state that does not have ballot initiative at the statewide level. So we can strike down legislation. We have power of referendum in order to put something that we don't like on the ballot, but we don't have the power at the statewide level to put something that we do like on the ballot. So if we wanted, and so that forces and channels all political activity that would be statewide law to go through our legislature, to go through our decades-long Democratic majority legislature, and takes power away from the people. So I think that one of the things that would absolutely have to accompany a broader approach to a multi-party democracy is the ability to allow the direct democracy to function as well. And the fact that the two-party system shuts that direct democracy down is a good illustration of how powerful it is. They shut it down because they don't want anybody else making laws. They have given themselves the power to make law in the state of Maryland, and they have taken away the power of anybody who doesn't go through their political party in order to do so. So I think that people always say, well, in Maryland we could just petition for it at the state level. No, we can't. We can't, because the Democrats have made sure that that is not a power that people have, because it would threaten them. And they are also consistently trying to raise the threshold on how on the process of referendum. So the process of referendum right now at the state level is pretty is a lot of signatures and very fast. But the state of Maryland and the leaders of the Democratic leaders of the committees that get to control this stuff would like to make the threshold higher and the window quicker, because they don't want people being able to have power over the parties.
Thank you. Any other questions? Thoughts?
Yeah, this is Michael Alston. I'm very curious to hear from the speakers what they think ranked choice voting, will that work for Black people, ranked choice voting, or will it be co-opted by the majority parties or by the Trumpers? Ranked choice voting.
Gotcha. Here's my take on ranked choice voting. I think ranked choice voting is a voting system that is a little bit better than the current voting system that we have. But I don't ultimately think, and for president, it would be great. For governor, I think it would be good. But I think we should look at it as a tool that helps improve elections a little bit. I think that the outcomes from it are not going to be drastically different. But I do think that it increases participation a little bit. It decreases polarization a little bit. And so I think those things are probably good. I think it would probably be good if we had that, but I don't think that it is a tool for justice, because I don't think it's really redistributing power in a significant way. I think it is it's math to get to a majority. And so I'm not against it. I think it's useful. I think it's helpful, but I don't think it's the end of this discussion on electoral reforms that create more opportunities for justice.
Okay, so what would the ballot look like then with proportional representation when I go into the booth?
Oh, sure. So there are dozens of different ways that this could occur. It could occur in a way in which you vote for just the party. It could occur in a way in which you vote for a party and a person. It could occur in a way in which you vote for a person without a party and votes move around. There's a whole bunch of different sort of technologies that have been used around this. But the general idea is that instead of ranked choice voting, where there's a transfer of your vote to something else if your candidate gets eliminated, you're really divvying up a pie and sort of saying, if the Ujima People's Progress Party gets 20% of the votes and the threshold for getting a seat is 15, then they get a seat. And so there's a lot, like I said, we can go into a lot of details about the way that the ballot looks and the form of proportional representation, but the concept is that governance should be divvied up based on the proportionate of the electorate, not based on some sort of mathematical equation that gets somebody to a majority.
Okay, thank you.
Nnamdi, do you want to take a stab at this one? Okay.
Any other questions?
I saw someone's hand up in there.
I do have some thoughts, if I may. Do you hear me?
Yeah,
Go ahead.
Bill Marker, yes.
Yeah, and thank you for hearing this. A comment, and then I'm convinced on one thing, not convinced on another. The comment on proportional representation seems to me, I've run for office many times, always unsuccessfully. So whatever, but when I first ran for council, I had to run in 1/6 of the city. And those were 3 seats. Now you run in 1/14 of the city. So by having smaller individual districts, more chance of somebody grassroots, somebody's known in a community, has really put in work, more chance of somebody breaking through, I think. So that's just a comment on that. No one thing is perfect, but that's a thought on that. And the other thing on proportional is the terrible bad things that have gone in the Israeli government over the last year or two is an indication of what can happen if a small party says, you got to give us what we want and do some terrible things. So questions about that. I am convinced, one I'm convinced, one I'm not convinced. I'm convinced that if I again we're in a situation that I was some years ago, because I am a Democrat and whatever, but I was looking for an alternative to one of the Democrats nominated for delegate. And if Andy had been the Green Party delegate candidate for that, I would have very happily have done that. So convinced of that. I did not choose to do so in that case. What I'm not convinced of is I think that the things that we want are probably very similar. The history you laid out, those changes are changes I want. And I think Andy's right. It's a combination of inside and outside pressure. But I'm not at all convinced that I should be doing my pressure on the outside rather than trying to do on the inside. And that by diverting attention. And by the way, Andy, what you said about the presidential stuff, you laid some interesting things out there that I hadn't thought about. And the ballot requirements and stuff, that's interesting stuff to think about. But I'm not convinced that it's not right that diverting, push for the left, push for racial justice, push for whatever, to divert that energy away from candidates within the Democratic Party to outside the party, that isn't a way potentially throwing away, that I'm better off pushing for what I want within the party.
Can I give that? So, Bill, I think that's an important statement. For those who are Democrats, I think that is your task, right? To push for the better candidates. When you know that there are a growing number of people who are opting out of the Democratic Party, we can't take on your responsibility. We've already told you we don't want your party, right? You're a Democrat. You have to fight for that, and you have to make those kind of inside out kind of fights. When people are outside of the Democratic Party, we have very little influence on the internal dynamics of the party anyway. So what is the option left? The most democratic thing is for people who are not registered as Democrats to have a process and institution that they can have influence over, right? And be able to develop really strong arguments about why their candidates and why their platforms should be voted for, right? The truth is that if there's a stronger outside presence that's organized, it can have a very influential struggle, right, on people like yourself who are saying, nudging folks like, hey, do you see what's happening? Do you see what's happening? If you don't make an adjustment, if you don't address this issue, then that issue is going to be something that we can't control anyway. I think the other problem is, again, this is a Democrat and Republican problem. In Maryland, the registered number of people who are no longer Democrats or Republican is going to overtake the Republican Party in the next 2 years, right? But that also means it's also going to overtake the Democratic Party in probably 10 to 12. People are opting out. And so it's a reality that the establishment, the truth is, I don't even think the establishment cares as long as people still vote for Democrats or vote for Republicans. The problem is that when you have political parties, people start to become organized, and that is problematic for the duopoly.
So, and I would add, the two-party system as designed works when there is inter-party competition around issues and for voters. And so if justice is not an issue for which there is inter-party competition and is in fact an issue of polarization, then the two-party system is going to work against justice. Because if the two-party system says both parties have to be able to offer a vision for what civil rights and reparations and restorative justice looks like, if that happened, that would be a different world than we have right now. But right now, that is not what we have. One party has tacitly aligned itself with justice, and the other party has aligned itself against what we call justice. And so that in that type of system, the two-party system can't function because it is supposed to facilitate inter-party competition. So what we need to do is to be able to open up different spaces and different angles where that competition can occur. So right now, we typically think of swing voters as people who might vote Democrat or might vote Republican. But if we want an increased vote for Black voters, we need to open up a swing vote in which Black voters can push politicians with the thing that politicians care about, which is a vote. So if we want to think about right now, say the Ujima People's Progress Party gets on the ballot in Maryland and is able to push places right now that are a third party, or the Green Party gets on, that are a two-party place, that suddenly starts to give politicians a different calculation than trying to always calculate toward the middle and calculate toward the right. And so multiple party systems create multiple places of pressure on the political party and the governing coalition. And without that, as long as justice is polarized as part of, as one of the things in the two-party system, it is impossible. You know, we can say, you default into this place where it's like, look, I understand that the healthcare you're getting right now isn't good, but the healthcare you would get under Trump is so much worse. And the logic of that argument only makes sense in a place where the only voters who are up for contest are voters in the middle between the left and the right. But if we start to think about it as a network instead of as a spectrum, we can start thinking that there are multiple places where groups can put pressure on people and create multiple levels of swing votes. That's how democracy works. When voters say that they're not going to vote for you unless you do X, and it's a credible threat that it might help somebody else, well, that pushes people to do X. And so we have to create venues, we have to create a system that facilitates that kind of competition so that we don't have voting bases that are largely left with the choice of vote Democrat or die, or vote or stay home. You know, and so I think that, and the other thing I would say is, as a progressive Democrat, Bill, I think you are strengthened by having an outside force that you can threaten your vote to go to, instead of simply saying, like, you know, instead of having to have the other option be the Republican Party. So I think that people who are in the Democratic Party benefit, especially people who want to push the Democratic Party in a different direction, benefit from having credible options outside of the Democratic Party where their vote might go in order to get the attention of their elected leaders.
As I said, in the right instance, I'd be happy, you know, if you were the alternative at times, you would get my vote. But if I needed an alternative.
Yep.
Thank you for the opportunity to say that, and respectful give and take. Thank you.
Any other questions, comments, thoughts?
You have a hand up in the audience.
Oh, okay.
Peace. I know I spoke earlier about the corporate interest, which is really a controlling interest in politics. As an organizer for working class people, it seems like a lot of political entities refuse to say the word poor, refuse to acknowledge that there is a class that isn't in the middle because the middle class has evaporated. You are either selling your labor or you are part of the contributing class, which is like the level just at the hem of the ruling class's garment. So they have a stake, if you will, in political outcomes. If you can donate certain funds, if you can funnel corporate assets to elected officials, and they can just disavow that it influences the way they vote and what policy gets approved or not, that controlling interest is going to permanently shut out people who are not only disenfranchised because they have one vote, but the corporations have more power and influence than your one vote could ever. And the fact that you can't get things pushed through on a local level, and that you do kind of have to acquiesce and make nice with the Democrats in charge of everything, which doesn't say anything for working people, because they too have vested interest in getting as much campaign money as possible, because they have aspirations to go further than their local office, like Angela Alter-Brooks, who is running to be our next senator, which is terrifying because our current senators are fascists, but she will not be above being a fascist because she wants to climb the ladder, and she's a former prosecutor. She's a fascist. So my question is, how do we activate working class people to separate their vote from people who have separate interests. They are not corporations. They will not be corporations. You may shop at Target, but you don't own it. And the owner of Target has a lot more to say politically and can get a lot more input on it than you're once every 2 to 4 years.
I'll jump on that really quickly. So I think to that point, the higher up in the elections realm we go, the more the influence of money, right, is just going to be. I would prefer to talk about local and state, because the truth is, unless you can get money out of elections, right, from big corporations, which I doubt, the truth is that the ability of working class poor people to first of all even recognize themselves as working class, right, not just this big homogenous middle class, middle of what most people don't even know. But if to be able to organize yourself and to use the resources you have locally can be made more competitive, right? Again, most local candidates we're not talking about people who get millions of dollars or even hundreds of thousands of dollars to run campaigns, maybe tens of thousands to run their campaigns. Those things can be contended with when you have a well-organized group, you have a really good network of people to talk to get your word out. I think the advantage of being a political party allows you to equalize some of that disadvantage, right? But the truth is that those things are about maintaining money. And then again, in a class society, people who have vested interest in maintaining capitalism don't want these kind of conversations. They don't want these kind of opponents, right? The truth is, and we often say in our party, we are running candidates to win power, not elections, right? And when the formula for winning power is really well known, you're going to do everything possible to be able to limit voices, limit organizing, right? Because that means the electoral process doesn't have the same influence it does over everyday people.
Yeah, and I would suggest that part of the way, I don't think we're going to get money out of politics for a very long time. I think it's here to stay, and I think both of the ruling parties have built their current existence on it. What I do think we can do is counter that, and I think one way to counter that is to think about public financing. But let's not talk about public financing as a way of getting candidates money, but let's talk about public financing as a way of getting smaller parties the ability to do the power building work that Nnamdi is talking about. So if we really want to be organizing smaller parties into vehicles that are healthy and strong and that can be an effective conduit between people and government, we need to allow those parties to do the grassroots work that is necessary in talking to people and building relationships and understanding what they need. And what we need to do that is we need money. And because we can do all the volunteer work we want, and that can get us to a certain level. But if we're putting all of this money into public elections, into public financing of elections, what we should really think about doing is putting it into public financing of smaller parties that are qualified on the ballot so that they can build the grassroots capacity in order to overcome or at least compete with the corporate financing. And so typically when we talk about public financing of elections, we're talking about public financing of candidates in primary elections. They get some match and all of that. Yeah, that's fine. But it is usually for the two parties in a way that is trying to pull them away from donor money. And it's an okay scheme. I sort of see it as ranked choice voting. It's better than the status quo. But if we want to talk about really redistributing power and using government to do so, we should talk about public financing of smaller parties in order to do the associational grassroots organizing work in order to be able to represent the people who are parts of them. And that's a policy solution that I'd love to see us be able to push here in Maryland, push here in Baltimore. It's a long way away, but I think it's the type of thing that allows us to actually structurally build parties that are different. So when we talk about one of the solutions is policy that builds better parties, it is things like public financing to do the grassroots organizing work that Nnamdi's talking about being necessary.
Thank you. It is 7:31, so I just want to acknowledge that. Is there any other quick wrap-up things that Nnamdi or Andy that you want? I know you all had a podcast you wanted to promote.
Sure. So We will be doing, let me share the link here. We will be doing a live stream. Nnamdi and I will be doing a follow-up on this on the 21st at 6:30 p.m. Here's the YouTube link for it. You can we'll talk about some of these things there, but we'll also go deeper into some of the technical parts of what these electoral systems look like a little bit if the conversation goes there, and we'll talk a little bit more about the specifics of proportional representation. And I think we'll also take a look at the reparations discussion that is going on here, and I think we can pick up some of that there as well. So link is in the chat there. You can follow me on X on GoGreen26, and we'll be promoting it there. And same thing on Facebook, I'll be promoting it there as well. And Nnamdi, do you want to say anything about that as well?
No, yeah, I just think that expanding this question of democracy cannot be separated from the question of class as well, right? It is literally possible to have a democracy based on top of slavery. And we know that's true because our ancestors lived in that country. And that does not represent what most people's idea of democracy should look like. I think we have to be aware of class as a part of that, and then ask the real tough question. If we want everyone to engage in a democracy, what do we need to do in society so that people are better equipped to really do that? And I think that's the hard part. And those people who are in power, those who are part of the capitalist class in America, are deeply, deeply invested in a demobilized electorate. They are very deeply invested in a under-politicized population. And that is the work that we have to do to get people, not even if you were to leave this two-party system in place, if you do not have a motivated base who understands what their real questions are, they can be misled into voting for people who completely don't represent their political and economic interests.
Very true. Thank you, Nnamdi. All right, we have we want to promote our social media real quick. Thank you all for joining us this evening for this conversation, for being involved, for lending your voices. If you would like to stay connected to BRJA, you can find us on YouTube. We do put we do put the videos of our events up on YouTube. So if you ever miss an event or if you want to share it with someone, feel free to follow us there on YouTube for those. You can follow us on Facebook. We'll be promoting future 13th events as well as workshops there. So feel free to follow us on Facebook. You can also follow us on Instagram at Be More Anti-Racist and on LinkedIn at Baltimore Racial Justice Action. So feel free to connect with us on any or all of those platforms. In December, we are going to be supporting the Black Mall, supporting Black-owned business owners here in Baltimore. So look for more of those announcements coming soon. Also, we are a small nonprofit, and we appreciate any and all gifts to support the work that we do here, not just our 13th events, but our continuing work in doing anti-racism work here in Baltimore, our other workshops that we do. So we definitely encourage giving. And we know that you're here because you care about the work that we're doing. So feel free to use the QR code to either be a one-time giver or a sustainer. And I believe that is everything. Thank you all so much for joining us, and hopefully we'll see you again next month.